Hello everyone, and welcome to this module on the introduction to the technological aspects of free and open source. In this module, you're going to learn about the fundamentals of open source as a development model, and you'll understand concepts like collaborative development, corporate and open source development models, and the principles of licensing, building, and deployment of open source projects. This module is designed for the beginners who are curious about the way open source software, open hardware, and open data are created and used. Participants who may wish to know more about the open source development works in practice, for instance, what tools and environments are used, what facilitates collaboration, and how the licensing model supports development model, would find this course interesting. The course is also well suited for PATLIBs, digital innovation hubs, technology transfer offices, and individual developers and knowledge creators. So the learning outcomes of this course are that at the end you should be able to understand and explain the main elements of open source as a development model, and to explain the advantages and disadvantages of the open source development model over proprietary corporate style development models. So we're going to be focusing on 4 main topics in this module, by first beginning with the introduction to open source technology, focusing a bit on the open source development basics, how collaboration works in open source, and a primer on open source licensing. Now, why do we need openness? Generally speaking, the open definition, which is stewarded by the Open Knowledge Foundation, focuses on openness as describing the idea of sharing and facilitating reuse in domains where access has been restricted by legal or other mechanisms, especially where scarcity or closure have been introduced in the form of intellectual property, because intellectual property is a form of artificially induced scarcity. So openness is typically defined in terms of freedoms: freedom to use, study, modify, and share the modifications. In this sense, copyleft, some say, can also be seen as a form of restriction on sharing and reuse. For instance, business customers may often be reluctant to use technology licensed under a copyleft license for fear of non-compliance and the wrong assumption that source code, which incorporates copyleft code, cannot be commercially exploited, and the concern of losing control over the code once it has been opened. In contrast, permissive licenses, such as the Apache 2.0, emerged to promote use maximization, which requires the material in question can be used by as many people as possible and for as many purposes as possible without any discrimination whatsoever. Now, the word of open source refers to the movement that was started and coined. The term was actually coined by a group of technologists who feared at the time, in the late 90s, that the rhetoric of the free software movement, which was first, could discourage adoption of open source software by business. The term open source was an attempt to reconcile the differences between the two approaches. There is not one uniform definition of open source, but the concept can be seen in 2 main ways. First, as a development model, development methodology, and secondly, as a licensing model. The term originated in the field of software development precisely because of the value that the development models gives to software. Now, very often, the open source movement is being epitomized by the idea of the cathedral and the bazaar from the famous essay by Eric Raymond on software. So, in this essay, Raymond relates the development of proprietary software to the building of a bazaar, of a cathedral, and open source development to a bazaar. So, for instance, he says, like proprietary software The building of a cathedral requires a strong organization, for example, driven by the church, to conceive a project, raise funds, and find a good builder and a team of artisans. The project's progress, therefore, depends on the organization's available funds and the builder's skills to supervise the project. Unlike proprietary software, open source software development looks more like a bazaar, where anybody indeed is free to sell their merchandise. It is the market sources that decide what is bought and sold, and so in a free market, development is collaborative with virtually unlimited resources and no single controlling organization. So that's where the value of open source lies. And as a result, the direction of a project may change at any given moment if the marketplace wishes so, and any project can indeed grow into many, many other projects. Now, as a development model, open source is quite flexible. What does that mean? Yes, it can adapt to the needs of the market. This vision has been criticized by free software advocates as incompatible with the philosophy behind free software. However, the truth is that practically every market resorts to standardization sooner rather than later. And essentially this means that the forking of either software projects or licensing terms is always poised to seize naturally once certain projects or licensing terms become standard in the community. Or, to use the words of Heather Meeker, open source in a world in which freedom is paramount, but some practices are discouraged, not by fiat, but by the consensus. Ibrahim Haddad, in his work, illustrates very well the differences between the open source development model versus the typical cascade corporate style model of traditional software engineering. What are the unique characteristics of the open source development model? Well, for starters, it really begins with an idea for a new project, a new functionality or capability for an existing open source component. The next step is to provide a design for the implementation and then a prototype of a capability and to translate it into an idea, into running software. So long as software runs, it's released as a development release, even though it may contain known or unknown, indeed, bugs. So the release philosophy can be summarized as release early and release often. Furthermore, the open source development model follows a bottom-up development approach. So that means project members who do most of the work get the most say when it comes to making design and implementation decisions. Those who do most work get the most say, and that's only natural in open source communities. And the relationships between developers are very important, and that's essentially the role of the community. On the release early and release often approach, it is important to understand that in open source we don't usually wait to have a fully working version to make the code public. So, for instance, peer review, where all members of the community can comment and offer suggestions and bug fixes, are essential. It is an essential element of open source development. Furthermore, small incremental changes that are easier to understand and test are some of the virtues of this collaborative development model. Members of the open source project also review the code, provide comments and feedback to improve the quality and functionality. They run tests to catch bugs and provide enhancements as early as possible in the development lifecycle. So what's the outcome of all this? Well, the outcome is really high quality code. Now, importantly, unlike proprietary development, in open source, extra features are often small and non-intrusive. It's also easier to understand small patches and code changes than big changes in the code of big architectural redesigns, for example. Furthermore, small changes are important because they help focus the testing phase, which is cyclical and ongoing with every increment of the software. And a small change is less likely to have unintended consequences, which again is one of the virtues of the open source model. Importantly, the flagging of security issues is a paramount advantage of the open source development model. Security is taken very seriously within the open source communities, and any development or capability that jeopardizes the security of the software is flagged and not included in the software until the security concern at stake has been addressed. So extensive peer review essentially leads to quick bug fixes, and then this runs cyclically over time. Users, importantly, are always involved in all stages of the development process, which is not always typical of corporate style in development. So here you can see that there are also differences in terms of communication. So, for example, in open source, we have geographically distributed development without face-to-face meetings or conference calls, with email being the primary means of communication and chat for quick discussions. Unlike corporate development models where you depend typically on a corporate structure, developers can be concentrated in several locations. There are usually project review meetings on a regular basis, and conference calls are indeed the norm. When it comes to hierarchy, in open source, we rely much more on decentralized teams with very little hierarchy. If there is one, it is loose. Those who contribute the most are those with the most say about the project. There are no formal requirements for joining, less formality, but very strong, unwritten community-made rules. And so there are expectations of respectful interactions, reasoned arguments, and engagement with the community. Bottom-up development approach driven by meritocracy, and project members always contribute if and when they want. There are also negotiable quality levels in open source, which means we first focus on creating a working prototype or proof of concept, normally then try and incrementally build and improve. And then typically we have in open source project leaders who manage the project by means of consensus. In contrast, in the corporate development model, we have a very well-structured and well-defined set of roles. For instance, roles like project architect, senior developer, and so on and so forth. There are formal processes for involvement of new team members, very strict company rules and regulations, typically top-down management approach, and specific criteria adopted for performance measurement and management. Members are also usually fully dedicated to the project and must adhere to strict project deadlines, milestones, and deliverables. There are well-developed internal quality assurance processes, and project leaders typically are responsible for meeting requirements, dealing with communication and resolution of conflict, for instance. The open source and corporate style development also differ in terms of culture. So the open source communities focus on developers' individual interests, whereas in the corporate world, developers typically work on projects assigned to them by a project leader, and they're just paid to work on company projects. In contrast, in open source, we rely mostly on volunteers who contribute out of purely altruistic reasons or desire to achieve real-world impact. In open source, there is a great deal of uncertainty when it comes to release schedules and changing attitudes to what is considered interesting. This is very important in open source, whereas in corporate style development, the motivation for improvement of the software is typically driven by consumer demand. Transparency and peer review are the rule in open source, whereas in corporate style development, closed product development groups typically not available to other employees in the company are indeed the norm. In open source, code contributions are written by other developers, and they're often very well received. Whereas in the corporate world, a mentality of not invented here dominates, which basically means that accepting contributions from external parties is typically not something corporations are keen on doing. And then in open source, code reuse and automation are a dominant technique, and the source code tree is always open and available to anyone to access. Whereas in corporate style development, open source policies dictate the rules of contribution, so developers have to adhere strictly to the rules of these policies. And there are also strict rules on who can access the source tree. Now, in terms of licensing, this topic has already been touched in other modules, so we're not going to be focusing extensively here. But the main principle is to say that copyright always applies by default unless we have chosen a different license to apply to it, and we as authors, as developers, choose how to regulate what happens with our copyright that automatically subsists in the source code. No license does not mean public domain. This is a very important clarification because copyright rules always apply by default. This means that if you have not chosen to license your work on a specific license, typically a third party may not do anything unless it falls under the category of a statutory exception or limitation, meaning you as an author have the ultimate control of how to distribute and how to allow use and reuse of your work. Now, software as a set of instructions executed by a computer is an object that is protected by copyright law under the heading of computer programs and, by extension, the heading of literary works. In European copyright law, this is harmonized by the Software Directive of 2009, which offers protection to the expression in any form of a computer program. But importantly, ideas and principles which underline any element of the computer program are typically not protected. Now, it is important to understand that the protection of copyright extends to both source code and executable code. So both the human readable source code expressed in a programming language and the binary code that is executed by a computer, which is typically not suitable for human reading or understanding. But both forms are expressions of the same idea and as such are protected by copyright law. Now, why do we license software? It's precisely because we are looking at allowing third parties to benefit from the full spectrum of rights that open source provides. So, for example, choosing permissive licenses, which are non-reciprocal in nature, provide third parties with more rights, whereas proprietary licenses and trade secrets allow the owner, the author of the work to retain more rights. Software licensing exists, especially free software licensing exists because we seek to ensure software freedom under the two main types of licenses, namely the reciprocal and non-reciprocal. Whereas in proprietary software licensing, the main driver is to limit ways to access and control the source code, and this is a fundamental licensing legal difference between the models. In terms of content and data licensing, different licenses might apply to these, and of course the status of data as protected by copyright law is uncertain in new copyright law, because as previously mentioned, ideas and facts are typically not protected by copyright law, and essentially this is what data is. Now, when it comes to licenses in software communities, it's important to understand that that licenses really set the terms of use and distribution of the software. They are the basis for establishing a working environment among developers and users, and they also establish the ground for software maintenance and support. Something else that is worth mentioning is that because of the two movements that run in parallel, the free software definition relies on the four freedoms, whereas the open source definition relies on the modalities of distribution and redistribution of source code, prohibition of discrimination, and other important terms. But for instance, for a license to be recognized as an open source license, it must comply with all 10 of the principles enshrined in the open source definition. Here you can see an example of the MIT license with the respective sections which provide the copyright grant and the notice obligation. Reciprocal licenses or copyleft licenses come with some specific rules and obligations. Importantly, copyleft licenses are called reciprocal because the downstream recipient of the software cannot alter the license terms. So this means essentially that copyleft software can never become proprietary. Now, some of the rules, baseline rules for reciprocal licenses refer to the idea that if you distribute in binary form, or if you distribute in source code form, the inbound must be equal to the outbound license. And in terms of obligations, you must make the corresponding source code available. You must relicense the software you received on the same copyleft terms. And so long as you have done that, your job is well done. Now, he will provide some of the guidance from a useful tool that you may wish to consult called Choose a License, which is available under Creative Commons license. This table summarizes the main baseline requirements of the different types of licenses: permissive, weak copyleft, strong copyleft licenses, and network copyleft. So thank you very much for participating in this training. Please consult the additional reading material. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the Zoom team. Thank you very much, and we look forward to meeting you again in the future.